All right, so while you finish with the notes, we will begin. So, like we said, this is just kind of like a state of the world in 1750. That's kind of what the purpose of this first lesson is. We just kind of set the stage for the rest of the course as a starting point. So, what we're talking about here is one of the major empires that is on Earth at the time is the Mughal or Mughal Empire in India. You will hear it referred to as either of those. And there's a couple of things that we should know about them. Early rulers were inclusive and tolerant. So, one name that we will hear is called Akbar the Great. Um, he's famous for being super religious tolerance and accepting of all different kinds of people. So, this is, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the Taj Mahal, but the Taj Mahal is a famous building in India. It's pictured here on the slide. And what it is basically it's a giant mausoleum. So it houses the remains of the wife of Shah Jahan. So that is what the Taj Mahal is. It's basically a giant grave site, essentially. Well, in the beginning, everything's going great for the Muggles. They are tolerant. They are an inclusive people. It's kind of all together now, and we all succeed together. And then what happens is later on, rulers become severely intolerant. So essentially, what happens is Muslim empire, the Muslim kingdom, kind of stretches out into this area, and the later Mughal empire is Muslim, and they begin to tax non-Muslims very heavily and kind of mistreat minorities, especially Hindus, prohibit the building of temples. So this intolerance essentially leads to the collapse of the empire eventually, and they become wealthy and they are successful for this, what is it, 330 or so years. Their wealth comes from a domination of trade. So they dominate trade in the area of the Indian Ocean, which is a major, thoroughfare for international trade. And they dominate that trade and become very wealthy as a result of controlling it. And that's kind of what their story is. So inclusive at the beginning and accepting of everyone, and then intolerant later. And that intolerance is what kind of leads to their undoing. So next slide, here we go. All right, I will give you a minute. Okay, so while you finish your notes, in India it is the Mughal Empire, and in Europe, Asia, that area, it is the Ottoman Empire. They are the prominent, most powerful empire in Europe at this particular time. In Central Europe, Eurasia, we'll call it. So they run from 1300 all the way up to 1922. So the Ottoman Empire is in power for 600 plus years, all the way through, the end of World War One, before they're dismantled. So they stick around for a long, long time, which is difficult to do. A lot of it is about strategic location. You can see the maps here where the Ottoman Empire is located, and it's kind of at the crossroads between Europe, Africa, Asia. It's kind of right in the middle of all of that. So they dominate trade. So the same as the Mughals, they get rich and powerful by dominating trade. That makes them very, very rich. Also, very similar to the Mughal Empire, in the beginning stages of the Ottoman Empire, they are a tolerant group. They are ethnic and religiously diverse. They accept all peoples and treat all peoples mostly the same, and everyone gets along for the most part. Um, the story of the kind of end of the Ottoman Empire is really a story about kind of slow erosion over time. Eventually, they will take on some policies once we get to World War One that will kind of be their undoing, and ultimately during World War One, they will kind of come out on the wrong side of that conflict, and that will kind of be the nail in the coffin for the Ottoman Empire. But before then, they are very successful, and like I said, they base that success on the control of trade throughout the Mediterranean region and the rest of Eurasia. They get very, very rich as a result. So we have the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And those are, we need to know about those two groups as far as New York State is concerned. And with the Ottoman Empire, we need to know the name Suleiman the Magnificent. He's one of, one of the names that could pop up. So we got to be on the lookout for him. He is their greatest ruler. And if we play word association for Suleiman the Magnificent, we connect Suleiman the Magnificent with the idea of this diversity and tolerance here. So this is kind of the word association we do. When we think Suleiman, we think ethnic and religious diversity. So that's worth noting for sure. All right, last slide, one more. All right, I will give you a second. Okay, so in Europe at the time, this is England, Central, France, all of these places, the major countries of Central and Western Europe, the dominant style of government that exists in Europe at this time is called absolutism. It is called absolutism because in an absolutist government, the king or queen has absolute power. So that's the way you remember it. So the era of absolutism is a time when rulers controlled all aspects of life. So religious, social, political, economic, all these different aspects of life are all controlled by a particular ruler. And these people are in control of everything. And the dominant theory that exists at the time in Europe is called the divine right of kings theory. The divine right of kings theory is the theory that justifies the power of absolutist rulers. So basically the way it works is absolutist rulers, and it's kind of a flawed logic, but absolute rulers, kings and queens, say that they are in power because God wants them to be in power. And when people ask them, well, how do we know God wants you to be in power? The answer to that is, well, if God didn't want me to be in power, I wouldn't be in power. Therefore, it has to be true. And this reasoning, this is called circular reasoning. In traditional argument building, this is like an argumentative fallacy, they call it. This is not a stable position to reason from or argue from. But this is essentially the idea. They claim that they are in power because God wants them to be in power. And we know that because if God didn't want them to be in power, they wouldn't be king or queen. And that's essentially how the divine right of kings theory works. And the important thing to know about the divine right of kings theory is that they're connecting God and a king or queen. So basically what this does is it strengthens the position and strengthens the word of the king or queen so that people kind of lend more credence and give more weight to the rules that an absolute ruler kind of lays upon their society. Essentially, the divine right of kings theory says that defying a king or queen is the same as defying God because they're linking them so closely together like this. So that's kind of the divine right of kings theory, and that's how it justifies the control of society and the positioning of kings and queens in power, and why it is them who is in power and not others. So that is essentially the idea behind absolutism. So I'm going to stop